You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Shoe In Show. Thanks for joining us. New episodes drop every Monday as a reminder. Part of what we like to do on the Shoe In Show is, obviously we talk about shoes all the time. The business models, the types, the marketplace. Matt, tell me what else I'm forgetting. There's everything and anything that relates to footwear, correct? But
that's right.
I think what we've seen from COVID and over the last several years, there's so many external forces that are impacting our industry now. And we, obviously footwear companies are really good at footwear and figuring out how to make shoes, bring them in and sell them. But we keep getting hit right and left with things like COVID. If you've not heard of that, then what planet are you on? But increasingly, we see a lot of more bellicose things happening around the world in Asia and especially in Ukraine. And so what we try to do from time to time is bring on some experts, folks that know what's happening and help us understand what's happening a little bit better, and kind of help us build more agility and build more insight and foresight to how we're doing business and where we're doing business around the world. And so today, I'm really happy to have my friend, who it's close to 20 years now, Ryan, which is kind of shocking. Maybe that dates us a bit, but Ryan Evans is joining us today. He's the founder and CEO of War on the Rocks. It's a digital platform for analysis and debate on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. The content that's produced on this platform is by national security professionals and academics, and it's read at the highest levels, at the White House, in Congress, at the State Department, at three-letter agencies. So when War on the Rocks puts out content, it is consumed. It's folded into strategy, into planning sessions, and not just in the U.S. too. I think there's a lot of government officials around the world, Australia, UK, et cetera. So it's kind of a global platform for security and understanding what's happening in the world. Ryan served in many different national security roles at think tanks back in the day. He also did a stint in Afghanistan as part of the human terrain system as a civilian. So he's been actually in war zones. He recently was in Ukraine, which is fascinating. I definitely want to get to that as well. But he's also interviewed constantly by U.S. media, trying to help explain what's happening around the world, not just in Ukraine, but in other aspects of the world. And I think Ryan has one of the most unique perches in national security because of his contacts and networks and trust that he has, where he gets to see the really interesting, thoughtful people who are experts in their own different fields share their ideas and thoughts. And he gets to work with editors and folks at his organization in taking that and trying to figure out how to explain that and put that out through their media corporation. And in fact, it's growing so well for what he's been doing. He's starting a new company called Bedrock that will be focused on helping better train military personnel and thinkers in business about what's happening globally and help build more skills and thought around that. So Ryan, I don't know if that's a good enough tee up for you. There's probably more things I could say.
Andy, I'm going to just bring you around to do all my intros from now on. So that was
I should do that.
generous.
I should do that.
Happy to be on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. You were on CNN a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of the most fascinating conversations I've heard around Ukraine, because I think so much of the media is focused so much on what's happening, right? With the current conflict, like the current, the troop movements, and obviously all that's really important. But you really brought it back to this whole idea of strategy, that the war in Ukraine is about a larger battlefield than just in Ukraine for the U.S. And it's about how it informs what we're doing in other places around the globe. One thing I think in particular that you said that kind of struck me and I didn't even realize was that, we look at our munitions, and we don't have a great capacity to build munitions fast enough to make sure we have the right supplies in future warfare. So as we kind of tee up this conversation, around Ukraine and things like that. I guess, I'd like to just hear your thoughts around that, around the strategy. Like how is this war impacting America's strategy globally, for defense and also, trade and other aspects?
Well, I mean, it's a big question. So I'll just start with how it's, in terms of the military strategy picture.
Yeah.
The United States, under successive administrations, Democratic and Republican, we've been kind of eager, maybe even desperate to sort of pivot to Asia, which is, as you know, where most of the world's trade comes through, and in terms of manufacturing and production, it's just unbeat in terms of regional importance, where you also have China as a rising aggressive power. But other parts of the world just keep dragging us back in. In 2014, it was the Middle East when ISIS stormed Mosul. And now it's Europe again with Putin invading, or rather re-invading, Ukraine. And so it's creating these interesting tension points in terms of where do you allocate U.S. resources, and just senior level attention. There's really no replacement for a president or a Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State, U.S. Trade Representative, to be focused on an issue. And now we're starting to have to spread ourselves very thin to support Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity.
Yeah, so at the here and now, we hear about spring offensives, and we see a renewal of kind of where the winter months may have been like more of a lull of actually fighting. Now we're starting to see that again. Are we going to see more intensity? And then what does that mean for the alliance between the U.S. and Europe, and other allies around the globe?
Yeah, so what we're seeing now in the battlefield is a sort of unimpressive Russian offensive in the Donbass, in the east of the country, along various axes. The only place where it's being somewhat successful, at least at this stage, is in Bakhmut. But Bakhmut has sort of taken on this symbolic importance that doesn't actually translate into a real gain. So Russian forces may well take Bakhmut, maybe within the next week or two even. But Ukrainians will just fall back on defensive lines behind there. And they've already blown the bridge over the river, and there's no thing about Bakhmut that makes it important. It's not a railhead, for example, which is of major logistical importance in this war. So the Russian offensive is not especially impressive. It's believed that the Ukrainians are planning their own offensive in the spring, and we'll see what happens there. I don't want to speculate, but we've entered this phase of the war where there's just a lot of attrition. Artillery has assumed huge importance throughout this war, and so these are lines that are just really pounding each other.
Now, Ryan, one of the things that I think is top of mind for all of us is one, we clearly as an organization, as an industry, are selling into the European marketplace. It's important. We've all extracted ourselves out of Russia and in solidarity with the West. And so we're trying to navigate that, and our sourcing folks are trying to navigate that, and our executives are trying to navigate that. But I think the question on my mind, I've got two. One is like the line between proxy war and a war between just two nations who are going at it. Like, where's that line, and how far, when does it jump the shark, if you will, and when do we get beyond kind of the proxy war line? And then I want to kind of pivot from there over to the impact on the China-Taiwan thing, right? So the House Select Committee on China met this week. It was a primetime event. H.R. McMaster was there, Matthew Pottinger there, the Deputy National Security Advisor under Trump. And both members on both sides of the aisle were asking this question. The thing that's happening in Ukraine, how are the Chinese learning from that, and how will that impact our partnership with Taiwan? So there's kind of two fronts here that our execs are thinking about. The here and now, as Andy put it, with Ukraine, and then how it bleeds out into other areas of the world. And I think they're interrelated, but I think that's one of the biggest concerns we face.
Yeah, as to the proxy, it's a sort of a loaded term. It's one of those words that has a value-neutral definition, like terrorism, but it also has a very evocative, emotional definition. And sometimes when people use it, it's hard to know which one they're referring to. So is this a proxy war? Sort of, but does Ukraine also have its own agency and obviously their own reasons for fighting this war? It's not like we're making Ukraine fight. So it is both a war for Ukraine between two countries, and we are also strategically using this as an opportunity to bleed Russia. Because they've made a horrendous error in judgment, and it's going to take them at least a decade to reconstitute their forces after this. And it's not a bad thing to continue to see their forces degraded as long as we can maintain things below a certain escalatory threshold in which we get involved. And then, of course, we're direct participants in the war. And that's when the risk for nuclear war goes high. And we'll be worrying a lot. We won't be worrying, not to dismiss the importance of what you guys focus on, but we'll have a lot bigger problems in supply chains when that happens.
So true. It's so true. No offense taken.
Yeah. The Taiwan-China issue is really interesting. There's a lot of debate over what China is actually learning from this and how they're maybe not. So what they maybe should be learning is invading a country is hard, harder than it looks, even when you think you're a lot bigger and a lot stronger. And Russia believed that about Ukraine, and maybe China believes that about Taiwan. But I think what this war has revealed is that military friction is a real thing. Mistakes happen; they compound upon themselves. There's a lot of contingency and chance that can work for you, could also work against you, and you really need to have your logistics together, your strategy together. You can't have this sort of top-down driven strategy that autocracies prefer and plan on being successful. And China's also learned that the United States has the ability to rally tremendous sanctions regimes. Now, China is also probably not unhappy to see us focused on Europe instead of more on Asia as we would be otherwise. And China might just think, well, we're smarter than Russia. We would never do it that dumb. And they might also think we're such a much bigger part of the world economy than Russia that sanctions against us would be much harder to rally, much harder to set up in terms of political will. And even despite the sanctions, Russia has actually weathered them in terms of fiscal and monetary policy so far pretty well, much better than anyone expected, right? And so China's might be thinking, maybe we can still get away with this. There's also a lot of interesting warfighting lessons that we can get to, but that's sort of the big strategic picture.
Let's go into a little bit more about from the start you were talking about how this stretches America and it stretches our capabilities. And I do want to lean into that question about munitions. I mean, I know we do footwear, but manufacturing munitions, on CNN, you made the comment we're not as robust as we need to be on our manufacturing. Kind of lean into that a little bit, that whole idea. Can you share a little bit more about that? I think our listeners would really be shocked and interested to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, we've really failed to modernize our defense industrial base. And this is not a new thing. This is something that goes back to the 60s, right? And to give you one example, so there's two precursor chemicals to gunpowder. I don't remember the names of them, so don't ask me to give you the names, but there's two of them. How many plants in the United States do you think we have to produce one of those two precursor chemicals?
20.
0.
Huh? You'd say 0. Andy, what do you think?
I say 20.
So we have one, and it's actually in Virginia, so not too far from you. And it's not just the only one in the United States; it's the only one in the Western Hemisphere.
Oh my gosh!
And so I'm not just talking about gunpowder for the military. I'm talking about gunpowder for everybody, for the firearms that we may own in our homes, to what hobbyists and sportsmen use, to the military. So that's just one of many examples of where things are brittle. So that plant goes out, we run out of ammo pretty quickly, right? I could give you other examples about artillery fuses where it's one place that makes them all, or the gas covers for military aircraft, which is one plant, and a lot of these are mom and pop shops. And it's not that they're bad manufacturers. It's just that there's no diversification. There's no redundancy built into the system. The administration, Congress are aware of this. They're not moving on it fast. This is something that friends of mine in the military have been talking about for years. Now people are finally paying attention because we're spending a lot of our ammunition stocks to support Ukraine. Now, these are not necessarily the same stocks for the same weapons we would be using, right? To defend Taiwan, we're probably not going to be using a lot of 155 artillery shells in the same way that Ukraine is using a lot of them against Russia. So whereas Ukraine and Russia, their military forces are much more artillery heavy forces. We rely a lot more on air power and precision strike, but you run out of that stuff pretty fast too. So there's just lots of examples of how defense our industrial base is.
Yeah.
And what does that mean when you hand over the F-16s? Or, I mean, there's all of this debate. Do we give them the jets? And, my father was a Harrier pilot in the Marine Corps for 30 years, so something near and dear to my heart. But as the president of the United States, is that talking about draining down U.S. capabilities? And the fact that I think a lot of people think, the president says send the jets, and then the next day people are up and flying around. It could take a year for those jets. I haven't even heard that on War on the Rocks, listening to your podcast. it could take a year for training and for delivery and training, execution before they even get them up in the air. And so these things aren't instant, but they become the headlines as to if we just send us the jets, we could win this thing. And how does the president navigate that in a serious way?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally F-16s are probably not the right solution for Ukraine for a variety of issues. I mean, it's not like, learning, trading in your Toyota and getting a Nissan, right? And it's even not like switching out a Russian or Soviet era tank and getting into a UK Challenger. Like, flying these different kinds of aircraft are extremely different. And the F-16, this is getting a little too in the weeds, but it's a multi-role aircraft, which just means it has lots of different mission sets. So you use it in lots of different ways. And so a pilot that's really good at one mission set might not do the other one well at all. And so this isn't about, one, getting them into a new plane and teaching them to fly it, which will take a while on itself, but training them for all these missions so they can use it well, and especially in a sort of almost air-denied environment. When Russia uses its own aircraft in this war, they're very rarely actually entering Ukrainian territory. They're firing munitions at a standoff distance from Russian or Belarusian territory. So, I just don't think the F-16s are the right decision for Ukraine, but we'll see. I've been wrong before. I'm sure I'll be wrong again.
What when you went to Ukraine, what did you learn that shocked you? What did you, when you walked away? What was something that you had to tell people about that you were surprised about or impressed about?
I'm trying to think of something that I could talk about publicly.
Here, we'll mute your mic and you can tell.
No, it's fine. I guess one thing that really impressed me is, and also sort of scared me a little bit, is, and I say this as a firm supporter of Ukraine right now, but so this is a whole of society war for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The whole country's been mobilized, civil society, all parts of society. And so everyone's sort of stepping up and doing their part, and it's great to see, and it's really inspiring. It's also super disorganized. And so there's just a lot of chaos. And it's not a criticism, it's just the reality. And so there's just a lot of competing lines of effort, people doing one thing and people doing the other and not being aware of each other. And part of that is just the chaos of war in reality. But I was surprised at just how sort of noisy the sort of information space is and the logistics and coordination space. But maybe I shouldn't have been surprised at all.
Well, let's talk about another person who recently visited Ukraine. That's President Biden. And no matter anyone's view of the president's politics, maybe at home, it was one of those moments where, one, I thought it was very, very gutsy. Two, I thought I was proud of our president doing something kind of to really show our commitment as a country, representing our country in a diplomatic way that took a lot of courage, right? And that's probably the narrative they wanted. They wanted that narrative out of it. But at the same time, talk about on the ground and maybe it meant nothing, right? I don't want you just to kind of say, yeah, it was amazing, he should have gone. But was there an impact on him going there? And did it help Zelensky? And did it really provide a shot in the arm? Or is it more kind of for media and back home consumption?
I think it sent an interesting and important message to Ukraine and to Russia, and probably also to China in a secondary way. In a time where Putin's theory of victory is that he thinks he can outweight the Western coalition backing Ukraine. So in that time, Biden shows up unannounced and says, and it really demonstrates in a physical and personal and symbolic way that we're here to stay and we're here to support Ukraine until the end. I think that was an important message for him to send to Ukrainian people. When I was in Ukraine, they understand how much they need us to stay in the war. And they're very grateful for it, but they're also very nervous about it. So I got lots of questions about, this was right before the midterms. They're like, how's this going to affect us? Or what about the next elections? This, that, and the other thing. So they're constantly asking about it. So I think it was probably a good shot in the arm for the Ukrainians. But more importantly, I think it was an important message to Russia that this isn't something we're going to give up on anytime soon. Now, having said that, we of course have elections, and we have one next year. So Biden might not be president in January 2025, and it's hard to know what someone besides Biden will do. If it's a Democrat, I think probably will be doing the same thing. If it's a Republican, who knows? If it's Trump, I doubt we'll be supporting Ukraine for that much longer. If it's if it's DeSantis, I almost said Santorum. If it's
Also showing your
well,
age.
Stranger things in politics.
yeah, if it's DeSantis, who knows? I don't think he even knows. So
I think so I'll build on that point too, because I think people fail to realize in America how important elections are globally and how closely tracked they are by allies and enemies, and how important it is. I mean, I don't want to turn this into like you got a vote session, but like our democracy and our unique power and situation in this world for good is noticed elsewhere. And I think too often we take it for granted here at home. We're too comfortable in some ways. Um, and then the other thing I think about, Ryan, is like, 15 years ago, how obsessed we were with the Middle East and all the issues there. And then all of a sudden, um, I wouldn't imagine even 5 years ago we'd be focusing so much on Eastern Europe and Russia the way we are today, and how things flip so quickly. Um, One issue that I've focused on a lot in my master's program, and then obviously now with what we do with footwear, where we make the majority of our shoes that are imported into the U.S. and Asia in different countries. Even Vietnam now having about 25% of the share. The majority of athletic shoes that people may be running in, listening to your podcast or hopefully our podcast, come from Vietnam. And I look at the South China Sea as a big flashpoint. I think a lot of people focus on China versus Taiwan, which is really important. My bigger concern is what we're seeing with the South China Sea. From your position, getting a lot of different, and I'm sure it's Ukraine heavy now, but knowing a lot of different experts and getting a lot of different articles and feedback from folks around the world. What's your kind of give me what your perspective is of the South China Sea right now as a flashpoint in terms of geopolitics, but also possible conflict?
I mean, there's just tons of uncertainty about what China intends to do, especially as it pertains to Taiwan. But I think sometimes we risk over focusing on Taiwan at the expense of other security issues in the South and East China Seas, and also about the Chinese Indian border, which heats up and sort of calms down every so often. So I think it's a I don't have anything particularly original to say. I will say personally, I actually don't think the risk of a war over Taiwan is very high. I disagree with most people in my professional community about that. Where you may have heard of the Davidson window, where Admiral Davidson predicted that we have the highest risk of Chinese attack on Taiwan coming up pretty soon. I don't think that's the case. I don't think China has some sort of secret timeline, and I think that China is currently deterred from attacking Taiwan, and this was true before Ukraine. So I'm not as worried about it as a sort of short, medium term problem, but predictions are a fraught business, of course. So with my record, maybe they attack tomorrow. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, the Center for Strategic International Studies is run, and this was referenced in the Select Committee on China the other night, but they've run 24 scenarios, and I don't know the criteria. I don't know how they use it, but they published this note that, look, we've run 24 scenarios of China invading Taiwan, and they lose every single time as it sits right now. And so one of the questions was asked, I think, of McMaster at the time was like, okay, so what is China doing right now that would prepare them to actually have it be, 12 of 24 they win, whatever the threshold is for risk mitigation. Is China doing, from your expertise, are they doing what's necessary to build those capabilities? It seemed to be the narrative that's out there. So maybe it won't happen now, but are we just biding time for them to actually pull it off because they build up the capabilities?
I mean, yes and no, but that's not like a new thing. So ever since ever since the Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War after World War II, like the People's Liberation Army, their pacing threat, like their major contingency, has been retaking Taiwan pretty much that entire time. They've had other military challenges. They had the border wars with the Soviet Union in the 60s. They, of course, had their little dust up with Vietnam. Yeah. But Taiwan's always been the most important thing to them. And so they've been trying to prepare their military to retake it for decades. I mean, I was in I was in Kinmen, which is one of these islands that Taiwan holds that's so close to, mainland China that it's almost like they're sticking their pinky in China's eye. Like you see one of China's large cities from the shores. They have all
Xiamen,
these,
Andy's been there.
yeah.
Xiamen is right across there.
They have all these World War II era U.S. tanks on the Taiwanese beach pointing at China, and there's a huge industry of knife makers who take these shells from the steel from the shells that the People's Liberation Army used to fire at them for years, and that are still in the beaches and in the sands, and they make knives and cutlery out of them. So like, this is just a human illustration of the fact that this is not a new thing, China planning to attack Taiwan. They have plans to do this. They've had plans for decades. That doesn't necessarily it's going to mean it's going to happen. We have war plans for all sorts of countries. We have a war plan for Iran. I hope we don't have to use it. We have a war plan for Russia. Boy, do I hope we don't have to use that one. Same with China. Like, it's the job of countries to prepare to fight their adversaries, and so we shouldn't be shocked or offended that China's doing this too. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't support Taiwan. Which doesn't mean we should. But it's like, this is just what being a country and being a major power is.
I think the focus, you said, there's other things going on in the South China Sea that we need to be focused on. I think the focus is the fact that we have this red line with Taiwan, that if it gets crossed, we're going to show up. And people get nervous about that, what that looks like. And we've been telling our members, it's one thing to shut down your sneaker shop in Moscow in response to the Ukrainian invasion. It's a whole different thing when China invades Taiwan of shutting down manufacturing and pulling away 60% of the volume that is shipped to the United States.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why we keep coaching our folks, like, be thinking critically about what you would do as a corporation, as a public entity in response to that. Because everyone put up the Ukrainian flag on their website like instantly when a year ago. But now that's going to be a different corporate calculation if it comes to fruition. So I appreciate you level setting us on what the history has been, because everyone feels like it's just around, tomorrow we'll wake up and it will have happened. It will have happened.
I just want to end on one important point related to what you just said, Matt, because I'm glad you said that. And it's sort of a plug, but this is something that I firmly believe in. So my other company, Bedrock Learning, is a social learning network for enterprises that touch the world in some way. And one of our big focuses is gaming. So some of your listeners might be aware of the fact that, there's this thing called wargaming in the Defense Department that happens where you sort of game out scenarios. And
is that Matthew Broderick? He did that, right?
Yeah. Different, slightly different concept. But you play out these scenarios and you try to see how you would react when the scenario happens in real life. And you learn from these scenarios and you iterate. We really need to get corporations and to include shoe manufacturers and importers at the table for these games, because of what you just said, Matt, is that these supply lines get shut down in a war. And so how are they going to react? How are they going to get their people out? How are they going to shift manufacturing to other countries? How are they going to coordinate with other companies, with the Navy, et cetera, et cetera? There's lots of planning that needs to go on that may or may not be happening, but gaming is a key part of accomplishing that, I think.
I think that's a good point. And I think a lot of big companies do scenario planning, but they factor in scenario planning around like cost increases or material supply chain got disrupted. They're not thinking about large external forces. And I just think, we focus a lot on Taiwan. I think a lot about South China Sea because of miscommunication. There's more countries involved. There's constant conflict, whether it's a Chinese warship using a water cannon on some Vietnamese fishermen, but there's constant touch points there that we keep seeing. And obviously the trade routes that go from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam through that area is a concern too. And I think this conversation, and so, number one, Matt, I think we should look at Bedrock and see what they're doing and see how we could plug in and use that more and get more footwear companies involved in that.
I agree. In fact, I was going to say this in the green room, but we might as well say it on air. We committed to prop up basically a working group focus on threat assessment and planning with China and Taiwan at some point in 23. And it sounds like a conversation with you, Ryan, off air would be the perfect start to that, to that initiative.
He came on to do us a favor, and now maybe we'll give him some business.
There we go. It's been great being on the show, guys. I really appreciate it. I would love to keep this conversation going.
Yeah, and as we end, I will tell people this is the start of the conversation. I'd love to have Ryan back on again, but also at our executive summit in Washington D.C. in April, we do have Dr. Zach Cooper coming, who is one of the foremost experts on China, Taiwan, geopolitics of Asia. Ryan, maybe you can put a good plug in for him since you know him so well for what his expertise is.
Yeah, that'd be great. Zach's terrific. He hosts one of our shows, a podcast, Net Assessment, and he's just really fantastic. So can't recommend him enough.
Folks, this is another great conversation, something I think everybody in the footwear industry needs to hear because of the impact it will have on our total operations. Not just one aspect of the industry, but the entire industry and our consumer base and our country and our allies will be impacted by many of these different issues that are occurring around the world. And we on this Shoe and Show, obviously, we talk about footwear and all like a lot of fun things, but we also need to focus on these external issues that impact us to help all of you think a little bit more critically. And as we discussed on here, we'll figure out more about how we can plug companies in to do better scenario planning in areas that it may not be a traditional focus to your agility. But as FDRA keeps trying to focus on these issues, we'll also try to lead in different ways, right, Matt, around what we're trying to do to help the industry and ways that maybe people don't even think about.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. I think that's what we do pretty well. If I'm patting ourselves on the back, because our folks are focused on inventory, costing, the next season's product, what shoe show they're gonna be at. It's hard for them to pick up their head and look around and gauge what's happening beyond the four walls of their own companies. And I think that's what we help them do. And this conversation will definitely help them do that.
Yeah, more to come. Drop us a line if you enjoyed this, because we really want to focus on what is important to the industry. And obviously we'll do these from time to time, but definitely let us know if this was helpful, insightful to you and your business operations. And we'll lean more into that if it is. But as always, shoeandshow.com is our full catalog. We drop episodes every single week with different industry leaders and experts, just like today. And we really appreciate you listening. And until next time, Shoe-In is out.
Shoe-In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.